Okay. At this time, I would like to welcome Victor Emanuel back to the podium to introduce tonight's presenter.
I've known so many people here for so many years, and there's so many memories of times I've had with them, and particularly with my dear friend Kenn Kaufman, who we're so pleased can be with us tonight. Kenn and I met in 1973 before I started Vim, and we've been on Christmas counts together at Freeport that he wrote about in his wonderful book, Kingbird Highway. In fact, the last chapter is about getting washed off the jetty at Freeport. I encourage you to, there are three great travel books, in my opinion, that involve birding. One is Feather Quest, that Pete and Linda did. Another is Wild America, what Roger Tory Peterson and James Fisher did. Another one is Kingbird Highway. They're great books about birding and about travel and about seeing the world. But anyway, Kenn and I go way back in the Mexico Christmas counts that he came on down in Catemaco with me. But just like with Pete, I mentioned some of my most wonderful memories of Kenn are his support and involvement with our summer youth camps. Right from the beginning, we started the camps in 1986. He was a great supporter of our camps. Every year, he was living in Tucson then, he came out to the camp to meet the campers and spend some time with them, and was just very enthusiastic about our summer camps. And now he and his wife Kim are carrying on that work at the Black Swamp Bird Observatory, where they have been involved in starting the Ohio Young Birders Club, a very, very great club. And now Victor Emanuel Nature Tours and Black Swamp have formed an alliance together to support youth birding and working together on that topic that's so dear to both of us. Well, Kenn would come out to the camps, and when we were camping up at Rustler Park one year, there was a problem that we heard about black bears breaking into people's cars because they thought they might see some food in them, and we were all in tents. And I said, Kenn, could you sleep in the van and be right there in the van in case the bear tries to break in? I mean, so Kenn is there behind the driver's seat sleeping, and he told me something caused him to wake up. He looks out and there's a bear staring at him. And he pounded on the window and the bear went away. So I mean, that's the kind of jack of all trades that Kenn is. To stay up, with the bear, so that our van wouldn't be damaged and could carry on the camp. But you know, Kenn has done so much for North American birding. Kenn and I both, for both of us, Roger Tory Peterson was a father figure, and we both had a very close association with him. And Kenn has carried on his work with his wonderful guides, different guides he's done, the focus guides, the birding guide, the other guides he's done in his series, carried on with Houghton Mifflin, the kind of work that Roger did. And it's wonderful what he's done for birding and what he and Kim do at the biggest week of North American birding up in Ohio. And I'm thrilled that he took the time in the midst of all that. His wife Kim wanted to come, but she's too busy organizing the biggest week. So Kenn, thank you for coming, and thank you for so many years of friendship and support.
Well, thank you so much. It's such an honor to be here. As Victor mentioned, we met in 1973. It was 43 years ago this month. It might have been 43 years ago today. I have to go back and check, but it was close. It was somewhere in that time period. And neither of us has changed at all. I still feel like, no, I actually mean that in a way. The approach, the enthusiasm, just the excitement of going out there every day is something that has never faded. And I can tell you that Victor as a birder is exactly the same now as he was 43 years ago. What a wonderful thing that is. And we have traveled quite a bit together. One of the best trips of my life, 20 years ago, going to El Tree Info, El Triunfo cloud forest in Chiapas with Victor, and being up there in the clearing in the middle of this wilderness and looking up at the comet Hale-Bopp that was going over. It was like the brightest comet in 20 years. You know, that sort of thing just happens when Victor is around. The camps, this is one of the greatest things that anyone has done, is having these youth camps. When Victor first started Camp Chiricahua, he really had to go out and beat the bushes to find any kids, any teenagers who were interested in birds. They were out there, but they were so hard to contact. You know, it was before Facebook, and so that's from 1991. The gathering there. Roger Torrey Peterson came out to the camp that year. He was a little over the age limit, but all these kids who came out that year, Barry Lyon was there as, you were an adult at that point, right, sort of? Yeah, well, Barry was sort of an adult. And I got to attend that year too. And so all these kids got this chance to go out and go birding with Roger Torrey Peterson. Just these amazing experiences that Victor has been making possible for people for such a long time. Now, I was supposed to talk about migration tonight, and I will to some extent, and it's hard not to think about migration when we're here. We're in this place. The first birding I ever did with Victor was on the upper Texas coast, and this time of year, it's so amazing to think about all these birds, these little warblers, something like a black-throated green warbler weighing considerably less than an ounce, taking off from the northern coast of Yucatan just as it's getting dark, and flying overnight, flying maybe 18 hours, 700 miles north across the Gulf. When they get to the coastline, the birders are down there on the coast, and we're waiting and watching. Victor and I did a number of spring migration workshops down here, and it's just, you know, you're just watching and saying, what's going to happen? Are these birds going to come in? Are they going to land? Because if it's good weather, if there are winds out of the south, they may fly 100 miles inland before they come down. So you're hoping for some rain, hoping for just a little bit of rain, just teasing the coast so they'll come down right there, so they won't struggle, but they'll land in the first woods. And so I was thinking of doing a whole talk about migration, but I was talking with my wife Kimberly, who is my best friend, and she's the smartest person I know, and she loves and admires Victor just as much as I do, although she didn't meet him quite as long ago. And Kimberly and I were talking about the fact that really discovery is such a big thing when you talk about looking at the world with Victor or with all the great people at Victor Manual Nature Tours. Discovery is such a big thing that's going on. And so I decided to change topic, perhaps not that drastically. Modern technology. It's just going out with Victor, with any of these great leaders who have been influenced by him. You go out, even if you're walking into the local park that you've been to 1,000 times before, it's a little bit like the feeling you have when you're going up the fjord, feeling like, you know, we may be the first explorers ever to come to this place. Just this sense of excitement and discovery. And so I decided that I was going to go in that direction with this talk. And talk about, I call this Birds and the Undiscovered World, is the topic. Now, I've been interested in birds for a long time. I got into birds when I was about 6. So I should know something about them by now, but talking about the undiscovered world is a challenge because, you know, it hasn't been discovered yet, so how can anyone tell you anything about it? So what I'm going to do is tell you a story about a kid. It doesn't matter what his name was. He was, we'll just call it the Kid. His initials were the same as mine. His initials were KK, but that's just a coincidence. And the kid was very lucky because he became interested in nature when he was very young. Just not able to cross the street yet, but he became interested in nature and fascinated with the possibilities in the natural world. And at first he was interested in big nature. He was looking at picture books. He'd look at pictures of rhinoceros and bears, elephants and dinosaurs, and then he'd go out and wander around the neighborhood, and they didn't have any of those things. It was just, it was the suburbs in Indiana, and they didn't have that sort of thing. So eventually the kid decided he would settle for looking at birds because they were available. And once he started looking at birds, they turned out to be interesting after all. And of course, for years, the kid didn't see any bird that would be considered unusual. He'd be seeing the really common sort of garden birds, and even something like a house sparrow. I mean, to an experienced birder, it might sound ridiculous to be excited about a house sparrow, but when you're 6 years old and you've put breadcrumbs out on the lawn and you're creeping across the lawn to get closer to this house sparrow, and you get close, it is just so intensely alive. It's this little spark of life. And so for the kid, he was looking at these things and just totally captivated and totally fascinated by the birds that he was seeing. And it seemed, as he went around exploring his little neighborhood, it seemed that almost anything might be possible. Now, something else happened just about the same time, and it might seem sort of odd, but the kid developed this fascination with Christopher Columbus. And the family was driving someplace, and they saw this statue, and the kid, curious kid, he asked, who's the guy on the statue? This was, this was back a few years, and so the kid's parents, they weren't like politically correct or anything. They just, that's Christopher Columbus. He discovered America, because that was what people used to say. And for the kid, this was really sort of heady stuff. The idea of discovering a continent, that is big. If you do that, you've done something. So the kid was thinking, wow, and Christopher Columbus has got the same initials, KK, and so he became obsessed for a while with the idea of discovering a new continent. And he would sit there, looking at the globe and looking at maps and trying to figure out where there might be a continent that no one had found yet, until his big brother told him that people had explored every square inch of the earth and there were no new continents waiting to be discovered. And for once, the kid actually believed his big brother. So he decided that he would devote his attempts at discovery to the world of birds. But even so, he continued to think of himself as an explorer. As he went out just around the neighborhood, he felt as if he were making explorations and trying for discoveries. Now, it might seem strange for a little kid to feel a sense of connection to this old-time explorer. We see these there aren't any photos of Columbus. We see these paintings of Christopher Columbus from 500 years ago and think, old-timer, but if you think about it a little bit more, every little kid is an explorer. Every little kid is using all their senses. I mean, that's not the kid in question, but look, she's using all of her senses to discover things about the world around her. And so every little kid should naturally feel a connection to explorers. This should be the most natural thing in the world, to be an explorer and a discoverer. And young kids are filled with this sense of curiosity and just searching and discovering, and it's a wonderful thing. And it's unfortunate that often as people grow up, they lose some of this urge to discover. They lose some of the curiosity. And as sad as it is to say that, maybe it's partly the fact that we get to where we know too much. If you know too much, if you assume that you know it all, you're not going to be learning anything new. And so it's the best thing possible if you can hold on to that sense of just exploration and discovery, and just the sense that anything is possible. And in fact, as the kid was reading about Columbus, he found out that this was really an important aspect of the story of Columbus. I mean, forget the myth about everybody else thinking that the earth was flat and Columbus knowing that it was round. I mean, that's not true at all. In the 1480s, educated people in Europe knew that the earth was round. They knew approximately the size of the Earth. That had been calculated years before. They knew about how far it was across Asia, and they calculated correctly that it wouldn't make sense to sail west from Europe to go to Asia. You'd be going 2/3 of the way around the globe. So educated people knew that. Columbus had, he'd run across that sort of thing too, but his success was based on deceiving himself, on talking himself into a different idea, cooking the numbers and saying, well, actually the Earth is a little smaller and Asia's a little bit bigger, and he was able to delude himself, and he was able to convince corporate backers to cover his expeditions. And if he hadn't been so wrong, he never would have had this great success. Now, the kid that I was telling you about, he was very lucky because he was learning about birds completely on his own. This is not to disrespect people who teach. I do a lot of that myself, and it's a great thing that people are willing to teach others and teach young people about birds. But the kid was in this situation where he had to figure things out himself. There's a particular kind of focus that you have if you realize that you have to see all the essential details on that bird or you will never know what it was. So he was in that situation. He had to look at everything and he had to take it in or he would not identify that bird. And it led him to all sorts of adventures. He had an adventure with sparrows at one point. He had figured out the house sparrow. It was readily available, but he was having trouble with native sparrows. Just his little neighborhood didn't have many, but the family went to visit some relatives in Oklahoma. And these sure-tailed relations, they had this big open brushy area out back, and it was spring, and the kid said, yeah, there ought to be some native sparrows out there. So he goes out, searching around this field, and sure enough, he finds a native sparrow. And so he looks at it really closely and says, oh boy, this is not a house sparrow. He watches it, he studies it, and then he goes back to the house to look at his field guide. And he's using an old copy of the Peterson's Western Field Guide, even though he's in the eastern half of Oklahoma. The kid was sort of a slow learner. He looks at this and, there are a lot of sparrows there. So he looks it over for a while and decides that, okay, there's a distinction here. Some of them are streaked underneath and some are not. So, okay, have to go back out and find this bird again. So he goes back out and the bird has moved. It's not in the place where he left it, but he goes out and searches around and he finds the bird again and takes a good look, and yeah, it's definitely streaked underneath. So he figures he's making progress at this point. And the kid goes back to the house and opens up the field guide. And there's still quite a few possibilities there. But he notices that there are a few of them that have like a little arrow pointing to the center of the bird's chest, like there's a blotch there. So, okay, have to go back and take a look and see if this bird has a big blotch in the center of the chest. So he goes back out, and of course the bird has moved. He has to search around, but he finds it, and takes a close look, and he can't be sure if there's really a dark central spot there or not. This is really getting to be a challenge. But he goes back to the house and he says, maybe I should take this book with me. Maybe that's why they call it a field guide. So he picks up the book, he goes back out, and of course the bird has moved, but he searches around and he finally finds it again. And it was just at that point that he realized that there were sparrows all over the place out there. He was seeing different sparrows every time. And the white-crowned sparrow was the only bird he identified from that whole experience. But it was a great learning experience. And so he was having this kind of experience a lot. Just making mistakes. Mistakes are just a great way to learn. And, there are different ways to go at this. I like to lead field trips. I like to lead field trips for brand new beginners. It's a lot of fun, but there's something I find myself falling into that there's so many different ways of teaching, and something that I fall into sometimes that's just so hard to avoid. When you take people out to show them birds, you really want to show them something good. You want to show them something good, so you go out and you say, "Well, that's just a cardinal. Don't pay any attention to that." And That's just a snowy egret. Don't look at that. Come over here and look at this really interesting gull. We can get really excited about this. Look at the amount of wear on the median coverage on that thing, and it looks like it's replaced some of the tertials, and you see their eyes glaze over, and people fall over backwards, and they never look at a bird again. But occasionally you run into someone who really gets turned on by that sort of thing. There are strange people out there. But it sort of leads to the question: what is the right way to do it? Is there really one right way and one wrong way to go birding? And we could say that sometimes it's a good thing to be thinking for yourself, to be totally independent, even if you're wrong. Like Christopher Columbus being completely wrong about geography and managing to accomplish something anyway. Independence is really a great thing. Independence is one of the things that we can get from birding that's sort of hard to find in modern society. You look at it, we're bombarded by the media with all kinds of advertising for things, and we're often considered to be consumers rather than citizens, and we're considered to make up a market or an economy rather than a society or a civilization. And they're surrounded by these things. You go to watch a movie, even if you paid to watch the movie, you'll notice that if the bad guys are drinking Coke and the good guys are drinking Pepsi, you know who gave the producers more money. So these messages are everywhere. But when we go out to look at birds, we step completely out of that. We're completely out of that world and into this separate world where humans really don't have control. And we don't know for sure what's going to happen when we go out there. We try to predict. Heaven knows we're always looking at the radar and stuff and trying to figure out what's going to happen with the birds. But we don't ever know for sure. We've got some birds that don't follow the rules, that just wander around. Some of the winter finches where their arrival and departure can't really be predicted. And just the unexpected nature of it. Every time we go out, even if we can predict a lot of the birds we're going to see, there's always that element of doubt, an element of question of what we might see. We probably will not see a piratic flycatcher tomorrow, but we might, because piratic flycatcher can show up anywhere in North America, and it might be at one of these local hotspots tomorrow. So, you have to think outside of predictions. You have to think outside of what you've been told is going to happen. And when you see an odd bird, consider the possibility that it might be something that isn't expected there. So birding really teaches us to be independent, teaches us to think for ourselves, teaches us to think sort of beyond the surface appearances of things. That's not a bird. This is a typical ecotourism picture here of the Masai Mara in Kenya. This is a place, I remember David Wolf telling me about this years before I actually first visited the area, but I've led some groups over there. There's a typical scene there at the Masai Mara with the tourists standing up looking out of the top of the Land Rover, and there's the lion walking by. And if you go to the Masai Mara and you want to see the lions, you don't drive out there and look for lions. You drive out there and look for the Land Rovers, because every lion, every cheetah, every leopard will be surrounded by a circle of Land Rovers. And the first couple of times I was there with groups, people said, well, this is really terrible. We are bothering these animals. We should go away and leave these lions alone, let them have some peace and quiet. Look how irritated those lions are. And for a while I thought that there was maybe some merit to that idea, but I was talking to Don Turner, who was one of the pioneers of bird tourism in East Africa. And Don Turner had lived in Kenya for years. And I asked him about this, and he said, he told me something that wouldn't have occurred to me otherwise. He said, you look at the Masai Mara, look at that area, everything about it, the elevation, the soil type, the temperature, the rainfall, everything about that area would make it perfect for growing wheat. And in fact, there are wheat farms. You leave the Masai Mara, you come to big areas of wheat farms. The people who live there have to make a living. Kenya is not an uninhabited country. The people have to make a living. And when tourists go to the Masai Mara, they're paying a healthy fee to be there for each day. And so the local communities around it, the people who live there, make a good living from the fact that there is this native habitat there and there is this wildlife, and so it supports the local community. If the tourists stop going, if the tourists stop bothering the lions and that source of income dries up, then it's likely that whole area will be cleared off and turned into wheat fields. And so, you know, the lions may be a little bit irritated, but they're alive. They're being protected by the tourists who come there. And this is the sort of thing, you know, we have to look beyond the surface and look at all the good that people do when they're going to visit places like this. We just have to think beyond surface appearances. Getting back to the kids' obsession with Christopher Columbus, I don't know if you can see the expressions on the faces, but here we have Columbus sort of exhorting the crew and talking about what a great adventure they're on. You know, the kid at one time figured that, yeah, it must have been just this great party. Everybody's on the boats and saying, hey, let's go discover America. But it really wasn't like that. I mean, Columbus was quite enthusiastic about the whole thing, but the rest of the crew really was not. And I sometimes feel like that when I'm trying to get new people interested in birds. You know, just going and talking to neighbors. Yeah, you know, you should come look at these sparrows. They're really, sometimes it's hard to convince people about it. And sort of beyond that, sometimes it's hard to convince birders that they should look at other aspects of nature. One of the things that I think is great about Victor Emmanuel Nature Tours is that it said nature right from the start. They're great birding tours, but they weren't just for birds. We look at other things too. And sometimes I get a little bit frustrated when I'm trying to get my crazed birder friends to look at other things. A few years ago, I used to be with a group of people that we would get together a couple of times a month and look at photos of birds and argue about gulls and shorebirds and flycatchers and things. And I'd photographed this coral bean. This is long enough ago that we actually had slides back then, but I had photographed this coral bean because I thought it looked good. And so I put that slide up on the picture, and the other guys are sitting there staring, and one guy starts laughing. And I said, what's funny? And he said, well, the bird must have flown away before you took the picture. Actually, I was photographing the plant. Plants are terrible. They're so hard to identify. You need to have some extra level of brain power to be able to identify plants, and they're doubly troubling because they don't fly away. You know, if you have a bird, you can always say, well, it flew away and I didn't get a good enough look, but the flower won't do that. You have to figure it out. But there is this other world out there, all this diversity of things that we look at. And if you're trying to get other birders to look at other things, butterflies are a good sort of transition, sort of gateway drug for going from birds to other things, because butterflies are almost like birds. And then if you want lots of diversity, you can go on to moths, because moths are just so incredibly diverse. I mean, there are about 650 kinds of butterflies in North America, north of the Mexican border, but there's something like 11,000 species of moth. And they come in all different colors and sizes and shapes, and it can take you a long time to track down all 11,000 species of moth. But you go beyond that, there's so many things out there, so many things to keep us occupied in terms of natural history, that it's like a treasure hunt every time you go out. And occasionally there'd be a time when we go out and we really don't see that many birds. Not here on the upper Texas coast, because there are always birds. You can't get away from them. But sometimes in other parts of the world, the birds may be a little bit lackluster, but there are always going to be other kinds of things to look at. And I really wonder why people don't pay more notice to these things. I sometimes will try these experiments of talking to people and asking if they've seen these things. Tree swallow is a super abundant bird. It's an abundant bird all over North America. There are times where you can see 1 million of them in a flock going into a roosting site. Very common. The vast majority of people have never consciously seen one. Yellow-rumped warbler, incredibly abundant. There are vast numbers of them. It's around for more of the year in the lower 48 than any of the other warblers, but again, the majority of people have never noticed a yellow-rumped warbler. But you show them something like the Nike logo, and almost everyone recognizes that. You've probably seen the statistics about the number, like the high school students, high school seniors who can't name 10 species of plants and animals native to their area, but they can recognize almost 1,000 corporate logos. That may be an apocryphal story, it may be not true, but it sounds good, so I use it in lots of programs. But sometimes it's frustrating trying to get people interested in nature. If we can get them outside, get people out to look at things, then nature takes care of it. And the nature can speak for itself and get people excited. But if we're in a situation where we're talking to non-birders and trying to get them interested just with words, then it's good to go back to migration as a topic because it's such an incredible phenomenon. Just the fact that there are these literally billions of birds moving these vast distances. You've got this just amazing powers of navigation, amazing endurance, and miles beyond measure and numbers beyond counting. Just the spectacle of migration is something that you can fall back on to talk to people about, just with the wonders of nature. And some of the great travelers among birds are things that travel long distances out at sea. Arctic tern, for example, flying from the high Arctic to the edge of the Antarctic and then back again every year. Might round trip of 25,000 miles or something, just the huge distances that these cover. Or some of the seabirds in the southern hemisphere, like wandering albatrosses that may wander the southern ocean. They may circle the Earth hundreds of times just because they're continuing to travel around in that space between the Antarctic and the southern continents. Just these great travelers over the ocean. But to me, the most impressive ocean travelers are the birds that are not designed for being out at sea. The little birds that fly across big stretches of open ocean to get to where they're going. And we're seeing some of these here. That's part of the excitement of being down here in these coastal woodlots and seeing something like a magnolia warbler or a Blackburnian warbler, a bird maybe weighing half an ounce that's just flown in from Yucatan. And it's something, it boggles the mind. You tell people that, yeah, it just flew 700 miles across the open water, and here it is flitting around, and if you scare it, it'll fly and go, it'll disappear into the interior of the state. Just these amazing birds. And that's when they're coming north in spring. In fall, a lot of them make longer hops. There are longer flights. Some of the longest flights of any migratory bird are some of these land birds and shorebirds in their fall migration. And especially with the songbirds, every fall you're going to have millions of small birds, land birds, migrating south over the waters of the western North Atlantic. There are some that go all the way to South America. There are some that are, they're only going, maybe 1,000 miles down to islands in the Caribbean. But on any given day in September and October, there are just going to be these vast numbers of little birds out there over the open water, flying hundreds of miles to get to these sites in the tropics. I think, we're seeing some of these birds now. They've gone south, they're coming back, and really this is perhaps the most impressive small bird in the world is the black-poll warbler. There aren't very many of them that come through Texas. So the vast majority of them in spring come north through Florida. So there have been a few around with these sort of easterly winds. But there are huge numbers of black-poll warblers that come north across the Caribbean and through Florida in spring. But in fall, they get very few in Florida, not here either. The reason they're not getting them in Florida in fall is because they're farther east. They're flying over the open water to South America. You'll get some of these black-poll warblers. That's what they look like in spring. They're named for the black cat. In fall, they don't look that impressive, but they're more impressive than they look. They do amazing things. Because these birds, some of them will come all the way from Alaska to the East Coast. They may be on the coast of Massachusetts, and they'll take off from there and fly for something like 80 hours, 4 nights and 3 days to get to the northern coast of South America. And just think about that. Let's pretend that this is actually, say, early October. It's a Tuesday night. Say it's early October. And this little bird has been fattening up. It has doubled its weight. It weighs almost an ounce now. And I'm not kidding. It goes from about half an ounce to an ounce, and then it's ready to fly across the Atlantic. So it's just getting dark Tuesday night, and this bird takes off and starts flying strongly out toward the southeast. And it's going to be flying over open water all day tomorrow. That's all day Wednesday. And then all night Wednesday night. And then all day Thursday, and all night Thursday night. And then all day Friday, and all night Friday night, and then Saturday morning it may come down somewhere in northern South America. I want you to bookmark this. Think about this Saturday morning of this week. Imagine how you'd feel if you'd been flapping your arms ever since Tuesday night, flying from someplace like Cape Cod, Massachusetts, down to the coast of Suriname or something in South America. I mean, just think about, trying to wrap your head around the concept of being able to do that. And especially for a bird, a young bird that's just hatched a few months before, making its first southward flight, having no sense of what's out there. Just think of just the mental toughness it takes to take off and just be flying over the open ocean. Just the strength it takes, the endurance, the toughness, the faith even, just to keep flying out there. There's really almost nothing in human experience that compares to that. But if you're looking for a parallel, you could go back to the story of Christopher Columbus sailing west across the Atlantic. We think about, here's Columbus in a little boat, just, he's all natty in his uniform, pulling up to the rocks, and we're going to get off here. It looks like it was all very neat, but in real life, it almost didn't happen that way, because as the crew was not excited about being out there. They were experienced sailors, but they sailed up and down the coast of Africa. They'd sailed across the Mediterranean. Just being out there going straight west into nowhere, they thought that Columbus was a madman. They thought he was possessed by the devil. They were convinced that they were going to die out there. They were talking openly about mutiny. The sailors on these 3 ships, they were talking about mutiny. They were going to take over these ships and force Columbus to turn around and sail back. Because if you see the green line on the map there showing the route, they were crossing the North Atlantic sort of at its widest point. They were too far north to hit the islands in the Western Antilles. They were too far north to hit Puerto Rico. They were too far north even to hit the southeasternmost of the Bahamas. They were just out there in the middle of nowhere. And so the sailors were ready to mutiny. They were going to take over the ships and turn around. But if they had turned around, they would have been going into the prevailing winds. They would have run out of food and water, and they all just would have perished out there, and no one ever would have heard of them again. But you know what happened, because you know what time of year it was. I mean, Columbus Day is October 12th, right? So it was early October, and all these little birds were flying south. There were all these birds, these warblers and shorebirds and flycatchers and vireos and thrushes were flying south over these open waters of the western North Atlantic. And the sailors saw these birds going by. They started seeing these flocks going in consistent directions. They knew that they were land birds and not seabirds, so they turned sharply to follow them. And within a day, they sighted land. And it changed the history of the world. We can turn and follow the birds. It's a good thing to do. Turning and following the birds is an important thing for all of us. It certainly changed my life when I was a little kid. Because birds will lead you to so many other treasures. There's so much diversity out there. There's so much wonder. One lifetime we can't even begin to scratch the surface of the amazing variety that's out there, but we have the privilege of trying and just getting out there. And here we are, we're in the perfect place to be at this time of year on the upper Texas coast with all these birds coming through. It's just an amazing thing to be here. And I would say if you don't like the analogy of Columbus, and I understand that some people don't. If you don't want to think of Columbus as an example, go back to the idea of the kids going out there and exploring with the idea that anything is possible, just going out with an open mind, expecting that anything could happen and that anything is possible. And if you do that, I promise that you will discover new worlds. Thank you very much.
All right, everybody, that concludes our program for the evening. And I want to ask Ken any questions. He'll be around for a few minutes here. But Bill, today, traveling with Brian Gibbons, or yesterday rather, if you left your commemorative t-shirt in the car and you're looking for it, please see Brian. Thank you.
But I'll have a nap on the bus, right? Okay. All right.
Have a great day.